begin first principles. A definition of a principle is that from which something follows, as opposed to a cause, which is that from which something follows with dependence. The definition of a first principle, the nature of a first principle is the first from which something follows. And the order of first principles, the ontological order is that God is first. The logical order is the laws of thought are first. The psychological order is that sensations are first. We sense things first. And the epistemological order is that self-evidence or undeniability is the basis for first principles. First principles of knowledge, there's the principle of identity, the principle of non-contradiction, the principle of excluded middle, the principle of causality, and the principle of finality. And to put them ontologically, the principle of identity is being is being. Ontologically, the principle of non-contradiction is being is not non-being. The principle of excluded middle is either being or non-being. Causality is every contingent or finite being is caused, and finality is act communicates act, or being is finalized, or being communicates being. The priority among first principles, the logical priority, is the principle of non-contradiction. That is, if non-contradiction weren't true, the other principles wouldn't follow. In the ontological order, the principle of identity is first. From God's standpoint, the principle of identity is more fundamental. From man's standpoint, the principle of non-contradiction is more fundamental. And then Roman numeral 2, the necessity of first principles. We'll talk about the objective certainty and the subjective certitude. And then Roman numeral 3, the ontological basis for first principles. Logic is based on reality. And then the epistemological origin of first principles. We'll discuss what we know comes first and how we know what we know comes second. And the meaning of first principles. The definition of first principles. First principle is that from which something follows, which is first in the order. And a first principle of knowledge is that from which something in the realm of knowledge follows. And we argued that the most basic principles of all are the principles of identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, causality, and finality. Of those five, and then of course the principle of finality, every agent acts for an end. Of those six first principles, I think you can base all knowledge. I don't think there's anything else in the realm of epistemology that is necessary that could not be traceable to one of those first principles. So they're the fundamental laws of all thought. Some important things about these principles. We notice that you state the principle of identity as being is being ontologically, or every being is necessarily what it is, or everything is identical with itself. And this is fundamentally the principle of unity, and it has two aspects, the ontological and the epistemological. The ontological would be being is being. The epistemological would be, I'm now on the top of page 7, the epistemological would be, that is the level of the intellect's relation to reality. It takes on the form of being is intelligible. So while as the principle of identity is being, and the ontological level, it's really being is intelligible on the epistemological level, for it is not so. The human intellect is consigned to total absurdity if this principle isn't true, to the absolute inability to conceive anything whatever. Every thought is unthinkable. Suppose you deny this principle, and that's probably the best way to get at a first principle, to know whether it's first. You say being isn't thinkable. And what are you saying? You're saying, I can think about being to wit to tell you that being is not thinkable. But if you think about being to wit to tell you being is not thinkable, then being is thinkable. Because you can't utter the thought about being that being is unthinkable. So you're right down to grass roots. You're down to bedrock, or as Wittgenstein would have said, the spade is turned. You can't go any farther. There you are. Now, the principle of non-contradiction has the same thing. Ontological aspect of the principle may be stated in several ways. Being is not non-being. It is necessary that being not be non-being. It is impossible that being be non-being. Epistemologically, there are at least two ways to put the principle. It's impossible that contradictory statements be simultaneously true. If one contradiction is true, the other is necessarily false. St. Thomas himself justifies the principle by pointing out that being is intelligible, non-being is not intelligible, and whoever denies this lives in the absurd practically and speculatively. He can't live that way in his everyday life, and he can't think that way. So it's literally unlivable and unthinkable that the principle of non-contradiction would not be true. The principle of excluded middle, this principle is the inevitable consequence of the opposition of the intelligible and the non-intelligible, of being and nothingness. As Thomas put it, whatever the subject, either affirmation or negation is true. In this sense, it is merely the logical consequence of the absurdity implied in a simultaneous yes and no about the same thing considered from the same aspect. Let your yea be yea and your nay be nay, to quote a biblical phrase. The fourth principle is the principle of causality. Now, there are some people who think this is not a first principle. They think it's not a first principle, but it's reducible to or dependent on first principles. But let's take a look at it first. The principle of causality is limited in its application to those things which admit of causality, namely finite contingent beings. It's a first principle with regard to finite beings, but it's certainly not a first principle with regard to all beings, because God is not subject to the principle of causality. In this regard, everything which is capable of existing or not existing has some cause, because considered in itself, it's indifferent to either alternative, and thus there has to be something else which determines it to one. Now let's unpack that a moment. A contingent being is a being that could be or could not be. A necessary being is a being which must be and cannot not be, by definition. Now, a being that could be or could not be is indifferent in itself as to whether it does exist, because it could exist or it could not exist. If it does exist, it has to have something to determine it one way or the other, because if it's indeterminate in itself as to whether it exists or doesn't exist, then there's nothing to determine whether it exists as opposed to not exist. Hence, it needs a cause to determine whether it exists or not exists, because in and of itself it's indeterminate. Wherefore, since there can be no process into infinity, you can't have an infinite regress of contingent causes, there has to be something necessary, which is the cause of all things capable of existing or not existing. Summa Contra Gentiles 2:15. In other words, there's a little proof for the existence of God. A contingent being exists. A contingent being does not account for its own existence because it either could or could not be. What either could or could not be needs a cause for its existence. That cause for its existence cannot itself be contingent. You can't have an infinite regress of contingent causes. Therefore, there must be a first necessary, non-contingent cause of every contingent being that exists, of which this is an example. In general, then, causality says everything contingent is caused. On the level of physical motion, it means everything moved is moved by another. On the level of efficiency, it states that every efficient action, which is a passage from potency to act, or potentiality to actuality, is caused. On the level of existence, it means everything that is not its own act of existence is caused. Ontologically, the principle of causality applies to contingent or cause being, asserting that since it is contingent, it cannot be, and since it is caused, it depends on another. The epistemological aspect of this principle states that it is necessary that the contingent be caused. It's impossible that the contingent be not caused. So the principle of causality is a first principle in the order of finite, changing, contingent, limited being. It does not apply to the infinite being, and this answers the old objection of the atheist: if everything needs a cause, so does God. How does it answer that? Yeah, it answers it by saying that premise is wrong. Everything doesn't need a cause. Only every finite thing needs a cause. Everything that begins, everything that's contingent or changed. If everything needed a cause, then so would God. As soon as you get to a necessary being, it doesn't need a cause. Why? Because it explains itself. It's determinate by the very nature of it, because a necessary being, if one exists, has to exist. There's no other way it could exist but to exist necessarily. If it exists contingently, it wouldn't be a necessary being. Triangles must have three sides. And necessary beings, if there are any, must necessarily exist. But a contingent being may or may not exist. I don't have to exist, but I do. That raises the question, why is there something rather than nothing at all? And the answer to that is because there is something which caused it to be when it didn't have to be. So the question, why is there something rather than nothing at all, is a popular way of putting the principle of causality. There has to be a cause for something that is but did not have to be, because it can't pop into existence out of nothing. So you can see underneath the principle is a fundamental premise that goes like this: non-being cannot cause being. And it's because non-being cannot cause being that when something comes to be, it must have a cause. The only way something could come to be is either if something could pop into existence out of nothing without a cause, or if something caused it to come into being out of nothing. But non-being can't cause being. That's absurd. You need something to cause something. Therefore, there must be a cause of everything that comes to be. That's the principle of causality, and it should be differentiated from the principle of sufficient reason, number 5 on our list. St. Thomas never refers to this principle. Now, that's very interesting, because many Thomists, and you'll read them if you read any Thomists, many Thomists attribute this principle to Thomas Aquinas. It really should be attributed to Leibniz, a rationalist philosopher of the early 1600s. It is not a principle that Thomas Aquinas ever referred to, and it is confused with the principle of causality. Confusing sufficient reason and causality is one of the main causes for skepticism and atheism in the modern intellectual world. And you'll see why as we go through this. St. Thomas never refers to the principle of sufficient reason, although according to some scholastic philosophers, he uses it in his third way when he argues from contingency to necessity. Others say that it is the epistemological aspect of the principle of contradiction. Regis, for example, says, but the principle of the reason of existence, or sufficient reason, is nothing but the thing's capacity to account for itself to human reason, to be intelligible and understood. However, the unintelligible has no reason for its existence, guarantees nothing, therefore is the foundation for no truth, however small. Leibniz originated the phrase sufficient reason in his book Theodicy, and defends it. When challenged in his 5th letter to Mr. Samuel Clarke, he defended the principle. Sullivan considers it to be broader than the principle of contradiction, since the latter applies only to finite contingent beings, where sufficient reason applies to God. It says only everything must have a sufficient reason, whether in itself or another. Causality, on the other hand, demands that every contingent being does not have a sufficient reason for its existence in itself, but must find its cause in another. Sufficient reason, says Sullivan, tells us that there is a reason. Causality shows us where it is. Now let me comment on that. The best way to understand the difference between these two principles is as follows. The principle of sufficient reason says everything must have a reason or cause. The principle of causality says every finite thing must have a cause or reason. If you hold the principle of sufficient reason is a first principle, you end in an impossible situation, and it leads to modern atheism. Because if everything needs a cause, then so does God. Now, either the cause has to be inside of God or outside of God. If the cause is inside of God, then God turns out to be a self-caused being. But a self-caused being is a contradiction, because you can't cause your own existence. Cause has to be prior to its effect, logically and ontologically prior, if not chronologically prior. If you say the cause is outside of God, then he's not God, because he's not first. There's some cause beyond him, and you have to go ad infinitum, so it needs a cause, and it needs a cause, and you never get to a first cause. So if the principle of sufficient reason is valid, you end in an infinite regress or a self-caused being. And if you look at Sartre, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and the famous atheists in the modern world, following Leibniz, they all concluded that atheism was impossible, among other reasons, because Theism was impossible among other reasons because God is a self-caused being, and that's a contradiction, and that's impossible. Why is God a self-caused being? Because everything needs a cause, as theists themselves admit. So what happened in the 17th century is Leibniz took this 13th century principle of Aquinas, distorted it, extended it, and ended in a cul-de-sac for theism because atheists use the principle to whack us over the head and say, see, you guys don't have a proof for God. Your very principle that you use to prove God, the principle of sufficient reason, disproves God. So what we need to do is move forward into the 13th century, if you get the pun. We've got to move forward into the 13th century and back up and say, wait a minute, somebody got us off the track, and it was that rationalist Leibniz. But it was not the existentialist, in the good sense of the term, Aquinas. Because Aquinas did not believe in the principle of sufficient reason. He never mentioned it. He always talks about the principle of causality. Every finite, contingent thing needs a cause. When you get to an infinite, non-contingent thing, it doesn't need a cause. Only finite, contingent things do. Hence, the principle of causality leads to God. The principle of sufficient reason leads to atheism.
Why is it, again, you said earlier that some people don't hold the principle of causality as the first principle and that it's reducible to other first principles? How is that?
Because if a first principle is something that must refer to all reality, then it's not a first principle because it doesn't refer to God. God doesn't need a cause. If, on the other hand, a first principle can be a first principle in a certain order of being, namely the category of finite being, then it's certainly a first principle. So it depends on how you define first principle there.
I was just wondering, could you comment on what led Leibniz astray with this? Did he do it intentionally, or was he just trying to expand the causality and went astray?
I think the latter. I think Leibniz did not do it intentionally. I think he thought he was defending it. I think here's what Leibniz thought. They thought that they could defend the principle of causality by showing that it was based in a principle of sufficient reason, the principle of rationality, that everything needs a rational explanation. And they just inadvertently got themselves into a difficulty where they were confusing reason and cause, and where they extended reason to all of being, and then reason and cause were used interchangeably by people, and then that led to the denial of the principle by virtue of the fact that it became self-defeating. So I think it was an inadvertency. And the way you can see that when you study these people is what they were really referring to is what we call in theology aseity.
It can't be something else. But suppose the cause needs a cause, and you say that it is a cause if it needs a cause.
Yeah, well, that's what the principle of cause, that's what the principle of sufficient reason says, as thus understood, that everything needs a cause. So if everything needs a cause, then you never reach anything in the chain that doesn't need a cause. That means it has to extend on forever. Because there has to be something that doesn't need a cause, or you can't stop the process. But once you stop the process and say, this doesn't need a cause, then it has to be uncaused. And uncaused is what we mean by God, so the atheist isn't going to admit that, so he has to say everything needs a cause. Bertrand Russell's popular way of putting it is, if the universe needs a cause, so does God. If God doesn't need a cause, then neither does the universe. And the fallacy of that argument is, he's assuming that the principle of causality means everything needs a cause. If you assume that it just means every finite contingent thing needs a cause, then the universe needs a cause because it's finite and contingent. God doesn't need a cause because he's not finite and contingent.
Did he argue that the universe is not finite and contingent?
If someone argued that the universe was infinite and necessary, then it wouldn't need a cause. And this is exactly why we say to the atheist, when he says to us, your concept of an uncaused being is meaningless, we say to him, your concept of an uncaused universe is meaningless too. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. He can't say to us, we have a meaningless concept because we have an uncaused, when he has an uncaused in his system too. Now, what the burden of the proof on him is to show that the universe is infinite, eternal, unchangeable. And if he can show that, then of course you don't need a God beyond that. And we'll talk about that later. What he's really doing at that point is playing a semantical trick on us. He's using universe in the sense of a more than, other than cause of all the finite parts that we know are dependent and contingent, and it becomes a surrogate of God, because his uncaused, eternal, necessary, more than universe is exactly the same that we mean by an uncaused, transcendent God who caused everything else.
One philosopher who's been talking about the universe posed the question, is there an end to the universe? And if there is an end to it, what's on the other side? How can we ever...
Same question, only looking forward or backward. Which way are you looking? Forward, end going forward, or end going backwards?
Forward.
Forward is another question, because the causality comes from the other end. If the universe is going forward this way, the causality comes from the point of beginning. Everything that begins needs a cause. You can go on and on and on and on and on forever. Just keep adding moment after moment after moment, never get to the last moment. But if you have moments lined up, there must have been a first moment. And that's the article that Bill Craig gives in his book. It's an excellent argument against an eternal universe. He says, an infinite number of moments can never be traversed. You can never traverse an infinite number of moments, moment after moment after moment. But the present moment has arrived. The present moment is here. Therefore, there could not have been an infinite number of moments before today. If there were an infinite number of moments before today, today would never have come. Today has come. Therefore, there were not an infinite number of moments before today. If there weren't an infinite number of moments before today, there were only a finite number. If there were a finite number, it had a beginning. If it had a beginning, it must have been caused. And you have an argument for the existence of God from the impossibility of having an infinite number of moments. Of course, the pantheist looks at that and he says, but that's all an illusion. There aren't an infinite number of moments. That's all part of Maya, the illusion, the error of mortal mind, and that's a little harder to answer. Craig's argument doesn't treat the pantheist. Aquinas' argument does. The universe, the changing world is part of the reality, the undeniable reality of your experience. But there's an argument for it in the sense that you can argue that there is a real finite world, and that you have to argue for, because the only way you can answer the pantheist is to show that there's a real finite changing world. Because if it's all an illusion, then you can't make that argument to a first. Only if you have real moment after moment after moment. If the moment after moment all blur, then you can't make that argument. So to answer the pantheist, you have to show that our finite experience is real. In that sense, yeah, we prove a contingent being first before we can prove a necessary being. The easiest thing in the world to prove is that there's a necessary being. That's the easiest thing in the world to prove God. The hard thing to prove is that we exist. It's very easy to prove God exists. It's very difficult to prove we exist. Because a necessary being, if anything exists, something must necessarily exist. Because nothing can't produce something. I mean, it was Jonathan Edwards' argument. You can schematize it this way. Non-being cannot produce being. If non-being can't produce being, the conclusion from that is twofold. One is that there must be an eternal being, and two is there must be a necessary being. Provided that there is something, being. So start with premise 1, something exists. Premise 2, nothing cannot produce something. And premise 3, an eternal necessary being must exist. So that's very easy to prove an eternal necessary being. What's hard to prove is that I'm not that eternal necessary being. That's the difficult thing that Craig doesn't do in his argument. So Craig's argument, William Craig, and this typical argument proves either theism or pantheism. Now you got to eliminate pantheism by showing that I'm not eternal and necessary. You say, well, I know I'm not eternal and necessary. I know you know you're not, and I know I'm not. But try and prove that philosophically. It's a little difficult to do. We'll show you how it's done later.
Part of the premise there, you just said that it's very difficult to prove that we exist. So how do you prove that
It's not difficult to prove something exists, but it is difficult to prove that a finite something exists.
How do we prove this maybe?
Because you know it isn't. It's a good question. It gets right back to first principles. Because it's undeniable. Just say nothing exists. Something has to exist, or you couldn't say nothing exists.
So then it would seem like it's very easy to prove that we exist.
It's very easy to prove that something exists.
Why not? Why not that?
Well, what do you mean by us? It's very easy. It's very easy to prove I exist, because that's really what's behind this. I exist. What's difficult to prove is this: I am not God. That's what's difficult to prove. You say, well, it's obvious to me that you're not God. That may be all part of Maya. So yes, it's undeniable. Something exists, because if you say nothing exists, you have to exist to say nothing exists. So it's self-defeating to say nothing exists. So in a sense, I exist is the basic premise of all. But how do I know I'm not God? You have to prove, because I change. I had a beginning. I'm finite. Now, if you can prove one of those, I change, I'm finite, or I had a beginning, then you can prove that you're not God. Because God, by definition, a necessary being, couldn't change, couldn't be finite, and couldn't start to exist.
What about the argument? I mean, the pantheist is saying he came to realize that he was God. Isn't that an argument for change?
Yeah. Yes, that's an argument for change, and that's the way I would go about doing it. But we won't get into that now. Let's move on to the sixth one, the principle of finality. The principle of finality says every agent acts for an end. It's an oft-repeated first principle. In fact, it is by this principle that St. Thomas develops many of his great metaphysical and epistemological theses. In its ontological form, finality states being as agent is finalized. Aquinas wrote, I answer that it is in the nature of every act to communicate itself as far as possible. To act for an end is to communicate itself. The good is diffusive of itself. Epistemologically, the principle of finality takes the following form. It is necessary that every agent act in virtue of an end. It is necessary that actuality communicate actuality. It's impossible that being as perfect communicate anything but perfection. It is impossible that perfect being act for a non-good or not be finalized. There are different ways of putting it. Now, of all of the first principles we've looked at here, and we've looked at 6 candidates, and we've concluded that sufficient reason isn't one, that identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, causality are first principles. This one, the principle of finality, is probably the most disputed and the hardest to get a hold of all of the principles. Nevertheless, it is a very important first principle. And it says that act communicates act. Actuality communicates actuality. Being communicates being. Now, put in its simplest form, you have these alternatives. Either being, when it causes something, causes being, or it causes non-being. When a being produces something, it either produces being or it produces non-being. But being produces non-being is absurd, because produce means bring to be, and you can't bring to be non-being. So being can't bring to be non-being. Non-being was never brought to be. If it's brought to be, it's being. So being can only communicate being. That's the principle. And that will also be the basis for analogy. The reason we know that there must be a similarity between God and creatures is you can't make something totally different from yourself. Hard as you try, you can't make something totally different from yourself. First of all, and most fundamentally, if you make something, it is something. It is being. And you are a being. So it has being and you have being. And being must bear some similarity to being. If it were totally different, it would be non-being. The only thing totally different from being is non-being. So it's impossible to communicate something totally different from the cause. The effect must bear some similarity to the cause. But, get this, before we take your question. Being cannot produce something that is a necessary being, cannot produce something totally identical to itself either. Because a necessary being, which is the only kind of being that can create a being, can't create another necessary being. Why is this impossible? Let's put a little necessary there. Wouldn't be a necessary being. Because a necessary being, by definition, is a being that cannot not be, cannot ever be brought to be. If it's brought to be, it wasn't a necessary being. If it's a necessary being, it wasn't brought to be. So it's impossible for a necessary being to produce another necessary being. What does that mean then? The only kind of being a necessary being can create is a contingent being. It can't create a non-being, because non-being doesn't be. So it can only create a contingent being. Therein is the doctrine of creation and the doctrine of analogy all in one. You must be different from God because you're contingent. You must be similar to God because you're being. God can't create a non-being. So the act of the principle of finality doesn't mean that every agent produces another agent identical to itself. It just simply produces something similar to itself.
Is this principle saying that being must produce being? Doesn't have to
No.
produce at all?
No, it's not saying it must. If it produces anything, it must produce something like itself. Not totally different and not identical.
This principle seems dependent or a branch of causality.
It is. In fact, all these principles should sound like they're interchangeable and interdependent and manifestations of, because you can start at the horse or start at the cart, and you can get at it different ways. So it is. It's a principle of causality looking forward instead of the principle of causality looking backward. Instead of starting with an effect and looking back to what produced it, you're starting with a cause and looking forward to what it's producing. So the principle of finality is the principle of causality going forward. Is being an attribute? That, of course, is a long, complicated question that arises particularly after Immanuel Kant when he critiqued the ontological argument, because he said being is used as an attribute or a predicate. And the answer to that is no, being is not an attribute. Being is that of which all attributes are predicatable. But being itself is not an attribute. Being is the reality of which all attributes are predicatable. If you have some reality, then you can call it this or that kind of reality and predicate things of it. It's a tall reality, it's a short one, it's a green one, it's a fat one. But you have to have some reality there for the predicate to really stick. So when we're talking about being, we are not talking about it as an attribute of something. We're talking about it as the something of which things are the attributes.
It sounds like an attribute to me when we say that God is being and when contingent beings have being. I've heard that distinction before. Is that incorrect?
Okay, does this sound like an attribute to you if I say, I am I? Does it sound like I'm predicating I-ness of myself, or does it sound like I'm simply affirming a self-identity that is there? See, I would argue that I am I, that I is not predicating an attribute of me, that I is affirming my basic I-ness. So in that sense, being is not an attribute. Being can be a predicate, can stand in the predicative position. You know, tree is green and green is the predicate. I'm talking about logically now. The tree is green in logic, tree is the subject, and green is the predicate, and is the copula in logic. Now, it can stand in the predicate position. God is being. But only because there's an identity between beingness and God. Everything else has being, and it has it in a certain mode. So what we are attributing to man is a certain mode of being. We're not attributing certain characteristics to that mode. All right, let's take a look at the next point, priority among first principles. we have 5 basic first principles. I'm arguing that these are the fundamental, self-evident, irreducible, whatever you'd like to describe them, first principles, that beyond which not. And is there a priority? That is, which principle is first among the first principles, if any? All the foregoing principles may be said to be first principles. The question now is which principle is first among the first. As Thomas said, not every principle is a first principle. Nevertheless, it must be observed that a principle of movement may happen to be first in a genus, but not first absolutely. That is why all of the first principles are first relatively. Only one can be first absolutely. Before a determination is made as to which principle is first among first, qualifications for this high honor must be examined. 1. The necessary characteristic of an absolutely first principle, as Aristotle defined it, the most certain principle of all is that about which it is impossible to be mistaken. For such a one must be the most well-known and not assumed. Hence, he first sets down 3 conditions for the strongest principle. 1, the first is that about this no one can lie or err. 2nd is that it be not conditional. 3rd, Aristotle said, is that it be not acquired by demonstration or in another like manner, but that it come as if by nature to the one having it, as it be known naturally and not by acquisition. Sullivan summarizes the essential qualifications of an absolutely first principle as follows. First principles, then, cannot be particular judgments of sense, but are rather the most general judgments conceivable and the most evident, which presuppose no other in the same order for their proof, and are implicit in every judgment. I'll take the 2 parts of that definition. An absolutely first principle would presuppose nothing else in its order. There would be nothing behind it, beyond it, beneath it. It would presuppose nothing else. And, secondly, and/or, that principle would be implied in every judgment you made in that order. If it's really a first principle, it's implied in every judgment you make, and there can't be anything behind it. Now, which of all of the principles would fit in that category? Well, some people say candidate would be the principle of identity. And this is argued by Jacques Maritain, for example, contending the principle of identity is first, and the principle of contradiction is only a negative form of it. The reason usually offered in defense of the primacy of identity is that the positive must precede the negative. It's argued that the mind has first a conception of being, and the first and most basic judgment is that being is being, which is an assertion of identity. So Maritain's argument will go like this. The most fundamental thing you can say is being is being. You can then say non-being is not being. That's the principle of non-contradiction. But the principle of identity says being is being. I am I. You can say I am not you. That would be the principle of non-contradiction. But I am I is more fundamental than I am not you. That's Maritain's argument. Others object to this, contending that it confuses the order of judgment and the order of concepts. The mind has a concept of being first, and the next concept must be of non-being, since that is all that's left. The first judgment, however, must be of the relation between being and non-being, which is one of contradiction and not identity. In short, the positive is prior to the negative only in the sense that the concept of the negative presupposes a concept of the positive, not in the sense that a positive judgment must precede a negative one. Now, this is a real tricky debate among philosophers. Let me just try and simplify it a little bit for you. If apprehension is the most fundamental thing in the order of knowing, then it would seem like the principle of identity is the most fundamental principle. If judgment is the most fundamental thing in the order of knowing, making a predication, making an assertion, then it would seem like the principle of non-contradiction is the most fundamental. And I don't want to resolve that now. I'll just tell you which side I come down on. I come down on the judgment side. And it seems to me that the people who work out of an idealistic Platonic concept generally tend to think identity is the most fundamental principle, and the people who work out of a more empirical, Aristotelian context think that the principle of non-contradiction is most fundamental. So without making an ultimate defense of either the a priori starting point, where identity would be more fundamental, or the a posteriori starting point, where contradiction would be more fundamental, I simply say that I favor the latter for the same reasons that Aquinas and Aristotle did, that all knowledge begins in the senses. You don't come into the world first with a bubbling storehouse of ideas and a consciousness of your own identity, and then suddenly recognize that something is different from. You form your own identity by negating others of yourself, and form a self-consciousness by saying, I am not my dad, I am not my mother, I am not the table, I am not the doll, and you form that by judgments. Now, if that is true, that's the way we come to know, then the principle of non-contradiction is more fundamental than the principle of identity for us on the bottom here. For God, on the top, the principle of identity is the most fundamental, because he doesn't have to wait for a world out there to know that he exists. He knows in and of himself that he exists, and that he's identical with himself. So for a self-existing being like God, the principle of identity would be the most fundamental one. I am I. And that's what he affirmed to Moses. I am that I am. But for a being like us, I think I am not you, I am not that. I think judgments that differentiate happen to be more epistemologically fundamental than the self-identity principle. Sullivan says, as to the priority of the principles, the principle of contradiction is the only one which is absolutely first in the sense of the definition of first principles. The principle of identity and excluded middle are aspects of or derived by immediate inference from the principle of non-contradiction. The principle of sufficient reason is derived from it by demonstration, he says. The principle of causality is deduced from the principle of sufficient reason, he argues. The principles of relational logic are immediately evident from an inspection of their terms. They may be regarded as restricted applications of the supreme rule of being, the principle of non-contradiction. The same may be said for the principle of any of the special sciences, except where these principles are the conclusion of prior sciences. Another way of showing the superiority of contradiction as the first principle, and I like this way, is by showing that it is the basis of the other principles, but the reverse is not true. Now, for a human being, which of necessity must think in abstractions, the principle of contradiction is prior to that of identity. For an angel, an intuitive intelligence that does not need to abstract, this is Aquinas' view of angels, identity is prior to contradiction. Regis sums up the reason for this. It could be said that for an intuitive intelligence, angels, the truth of the principle of identity would precede that of the principle of contradiction, because intuitive vision of being would reveal its existential actuality determined by a positive essence, quiddity, whose interior, indivisible, and undivided riches would in a way exaggerate it and oppose it to everything else. But our abstract minds, human beings down here on earth, whose feeble light fragments the real and can only unify it only by an intermediation of many comparisons. This is why the truth of the principle of identity can be defended by the truth of the principle of contradiction, but the inverse is not possible. According to Sullivan, those scholastic philosophers who contend for the primacy of identity over contradiction use quotations from St. Thomas favoring the primacy of the principle of contradiction to confirm their contentions and maintain that it is the same thing as the principle of identity. And Sullivan traces the influence of the primacy of identity among philosophers back through various people, and we need not go into that. He concludes, finally then, it may be asked, since the principle of contradiction is the only principle which is strictly first, why these other principles have been treated at all? It's because they also may be called first principles, not indeed in the sense that no principle is prior to them, but in the sense that each is first as the source of that particular branch of human knowledge at the head of which it stands. So it's legitimately called a first principle because in that order, the order of finality, the principle of finality is first. In the order of causality, the principle of causality is first. But the principle that is first among all the first is the principle of contradiction, because none of those principles could be so if it weren't true that a thing cannot, the principle of contradiction applies. Now let's take them one by one. Why is it that being cannot be being if the principle, why is it this principle can't be true? Being is being if the principle of non-contradiction doesn't hold. Then being might be non-being. See, the principle of identity says being is being. In order for that to be true, the principle of contradiction would have to hold, otherwise being could possibly be non-being. And if being could possibly be non-being, then being doesn't necessarily have to be being. A is only necessarily true if it's impossible that A could be non-A. But that's the principle of non-contradiction. A can't be non-A. So unless the principle of non-contradiction were true, the principle of identity couldn't be true. Anybody not see that? This is the summary of the whole point here.
This might be a naive statement, but it seems to be the possibility that we have to realize identity and non-contradiction simultaneously. Is that a possibility?
No, it's not impossible. In one sense, it's true. If you look at it from the top side and bottom side, that they're simultaneously true, because there is a sense in which the principle of non-contradiction couldn't be true if the principle of identity weren't true also. Because if being weren't being and non-being weren't non-being, then you couldn't say being is not non-being, because being might be non-being. So it depends on whether you're looking at the top side or the bottom side. The flip side of the subject will be the same. They are kind of interrelated, inseparably interrelated principles. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. That they're all first principles. You can't go beyond them, and you can't get along without them. And you don't presuppose anything beneath them. That they are literally first in their order, and each has a different application. I want to make one important distinction. Alvin Plantinga and people who criticize foundationalism, and this is a foundationalist epistemology as opposed to a coherentist, usually say that one of the problems is that it is deductive. That what you have is a whole set of first principles from which you're deducing everything else. And I think they're making a mistake, because while there are deductive foundationalists, Aquinas wouldn't be one. Spinoza would be an example of one. Spinoza, or perhaps Descartes. And as we've often said, the problem with him is he got Descartes before Descartes anyway. Deductive first principles, where you have axioms like Euclid and you deduce everything else from it. Aquinas, I think, would be called a reductive first principle epistemologist. And by that we mean that all true knowledge is ultimately dependent on, reducible to some first principles. Not deducible from, like a sponge you can squeeze it out of, but like a foundation, something you can fall back on. That when people press you, sooner or later you got to get back to first principles. If they say, how do you know that? How do you know that? How do you know that? You can't go on asking, how do you know that forever? That's an infinite regress. No one would ever know then. If you borrow $10 from me, you can't say he has it, he has it, he has it, he has it. Sooner or later, somebody has to come up with the 10 bucks. Well, now, you reduce it, you trace it back, rather than deduce it from. Another way to put it is, I don't think Aquinas really believes that you can take a look at all subjects and deduce from them what the predicate of a sentence will be. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. I think what he means is you can take a look at all predicates and discover what the subject will be. Let's give an example. He doesn't say, take a look at a cause, and you automatically know what follows from it. That you automatically be able to deduce the effect from the cause. Because simply because God can cause doesn't mean he is going to cause. So you can't take a look at God and necessary infinite eternal being and deduce from that what he's going to do. But you can take a look at an effect and reduce from that what the cause must have done to produce it. So if you take a look at an effect, you see here's a contingent finite world. You say, now what are the necessary conditions for producing a contingent finite world? It would be, ultimately you're going to have to get back to an infinite, non-contingent, necessary being as the basis for that, the necessary sufficient condition. So I think what Aquinas is talking about is a reductive study the predicate and you can understand the subject, not a deductive study the subject and you can always deduce the predicate from it. Now you can in some cases, and sometimes his definition sounds like that. If you study the predicate, all husbands, the subject, all husbands, you can deduce from that what the predicate will be. Are married men. But it doesn't always work that way. It's not always. Sometimes you have to take a good look at the predicate. Like every contingent thing has a cause. You can't look at cause and deduce that it's going to be producing a contingent thing. But you can look at effect and reduce that there must have been a cause from it. Am I communicating this point? It's an important difference between modern rationalists. Both of these are foundationalists in their epistemology. But it's an important difference between two kinds of foundationalists, and the present critique of foundationalism by Plantinga and Waltersdorf and the whole Reform group, strongly centered in Notre Dame and in the Christian philosophical circles, is built on attacking the straw man. They're assuming that all foundationalists are deductive. They give their arguments against deductive foundationalism, but they don't touch reductive foundationalism, which is another kind, nor what you might call transcendental foundationalists, like Van Til, a la Knudsen's interpretation we talked about last time, who are saying it's transcendentally necessary to postulate certain things as a foundation for knowledge, or you couldn't have this knowledge. Same thing Kant is doing in his first critique. Any questions or comments on this objective way of defending first principles by reduction or by transcendental reduction? Well, the reduction wouldn't necessarily have to be transcendental, whereas all transcendental arguments are reductionistic. Not all reductionistic arguments are transcendental.
The ones that aren't transcendental
would be causal. See, transcendental means necessary condition, where causal means necessary and sufficient condition. A necessary condition for leaves burning is that they're dry. Necessary and sufficient condition is that they're dry and you have a match. Necessary and sufficient condition means cause. Necessary condition just means necessary condition. Anything else on that? One other way to state it is that first principles are literally undeniable. They're actually undeniable. Now, by that we don't mean that nobody's ever denied them. Anytime you name something that's undeniable, you'll find somebody that'll deny it. We mean that while people can say, I don't believe in the law of non-contradiction, they can't actually affirm it without using it. So it's actually undeniable, though not formally undeniable. Well, they can formally say, I don't believe in the law of non-contradiction. And one of the ways to test for a first principle is find out if it is deniable without using it. Sooner or later somebody's going to ask you for the criteria for a first principle. Well, one of the criteria is it's self-evident. Look at the predicate and see if it's reducible to the subject. Another criteria would be try and deny it without using it. If you can't deny it without using it, it's pretty basic. It's basic, undeniable law of thought. And that's true of the law of non-contradiction, identity, excluded middle, and all of the basic laws of logic of all being, and the principle of causality is true of finite being. Sooner or later, when you try and explain a finite being without saying it has a cause, you're going to have something that could not be, but is, without a cause. But how could it be determined to be when it also could not be unless something determined it to be? If it really has equal indeterminacy of being or not being, there would be no explanation as to why it is rather than is not unless there were a cause for it. subjective certitude. The mind must assent to first principles. That's the first point that Aquinas makes. According to St. Thomas, once the terms of first principles are known, the mind must assent to them. He says that assent to first principles is not free. You don't have any choice about whether, once your mind understands the law of non-contradiction, your mind doesn't have any free choice as to whether to accept it. Your mind is forced to accept it once it understands it. Now, the assent of science is not subject to free choice, because the knower is obliged to assent by the force of the demonstration. Another place he says that assent is natural, if therefore that which the reason apprehends is such that it naturally assents thereto, for example, first principles. It is not in our power to assent to it or to dissent, for in such cases assent follows naturally, and consequently, properly speaking, is not the subject of our command. In fact, Aquinas even speaks of a natural unconscious inclination of the intellect to truth, a kind of instinct for truth. Now, for those of you who are working on law or first principles, Aquinas calls this in the moral realm synderesis. Synderesis, S-Y-N-D-E-R-S, is the natural inclination of human beings toward the moral law. And there is a natural inclination in the mind toward rational first principles, and there's a natural inclination in the heart toward moral first principles like do good and shun evil. And that's the basis for the natural law. What Roman Catholics call natural law, and you and I have been prone to call general revelation or the law written on their hearts, Romans 2:12 through 14. And there's an interesting parallel here. Just as the mind leans naturally toward rational first principles, so the heart leans naturally toward moral first principles. The mind can distort first principles, and the heart can distort first principles, but there is a natural inclination. You are born with an instinct for truth, a synderesis, a bend, an inclination, a propensity. Use any of those terms you like. It's the same thing Augustine said about depravity. You are born with the necessity to die and the propensity to sin. So you're born with the propensity toward truth. For truth is the intellect's good and the term of its natural inclination, and just as things without knowledge are moved toward their end without knowing it, so sometimes does the human intellect by a natural inclination tend toward truth, although it does not perceive its nature. Another way to put that, and the way I like to put it best, is that you know things by inclination before you know them by cognition. So you say, well, I just intuitively know that's wrong. Why do you intuitively know that's wrong? Because you know things by inclination before you know them by cognition. Before you think about it and rationalize about it, you just naturally can that. Why? Because God built you that way. Man is built in such a direction, imago Dei, that he bends naturally toward first principles of truth and first principles of action, called intellectual and moral, respectively. The reason for this natural predisposition of truth is as follows. Everything that comes from God receives from him a certain nature by which it is related to its final end. It's also true that every power has a natural appetite with respect to its proper good, and with the exception of the will, all the powers of the soul are necessitated by their object. Well, why does he have to say that? With the exception of the will, the proper object of any power you have, the mind to truth, the heart to good, or whatever, the proper object always necessitates you in that direction with the exception of the will. There wouldn't be any freedom of the will if that were so. So the natural object of the will does not necessitate choice. If it did, we would be unfree. Certitude about first principles, then, comes from the fact that the intellect is naturally determined to the truth, and man is not free to dissent. The reason the mind must assent to them is that they are reducible to the principle of non-contradiction, to which the mind cannot dissent. The first principle of all assent is stated as a modal proposition. On the other hand, all other immediate assent imply the first assent, and mediate assent can only exist only insofar as they can be reduced to the principle of non-contradiction. In his Hermeneutics, Lecture 6. Now, certitude and assent differ. Certitude is always accompanied by assent, That is, the mind always assents to propositions that are certain. However, assent is not always accompanied by certitude. One may assent to something as being only probable and not necessary. As in the case of man's everyday life. In the business affairs of men, there is no such thing as demonstrative and infallible proof. And we must be content with a certain conjectural probability, such as that which an orator employs to persuade. One may also assent to the conclusion of a probable induction, but not with certitude. For he who proceeds inductively through singular to universal does not demonstrate, or does he construct a necessarily conclusive syllogism.